Today, we're diving into a really intense legal battle happening in Japan, one that raises huge questions about politics, fairness, and the rule of law. It all centers on the government's unprecedented move to dissolve a major religious organization. So let's get right into it. This whole story really boils down to one single baffling question. How on earth did the Japanese government's understanding of a law that's been on the books for decades, do a complete 180-degree flip in less than 24 hours? Well, according to the source we're looking at, the answer is a messy mix of high-stakes politics and legal principles being pushed right to their absolute limit. And get this, the timeline is just startling. On October 18th, you have the Prime Minister in Parliament confirming the government's long-standing position you need a criminal law violation to even think about dissolving a religious group. Then, by the very next day, poof, that standard is gone. All of a sudden, civil disputes are supposedly enough. All right, so first up, let's really break down this pretty dramatic shift. What exactly changed? And more importantly, what does our source suggest was the real driver behind it all? Yeah, just to be super clear, this wasn't some minor little tweak in the language. The government completely moved the goalposts here. They went from needing a proven criminal act, which is a really high bar to clear, to saying that civil law torts, which are basically private disputes between people, often about money, could be enough to dissolve an entire organization. That is a massive expansion of state power, and it happened almost overnight. So, you gotta ask, why the sudden flip-flop? Well, the source for analyzing argues that you're probably not going to find the answer in any law book. The real reason it suggests is just raw political calculation. According to a Mainichi Shimbun analysis that's cited in the source, the backdrop here was a full-blown political crisis. See, the Kishida cabinet's approval ratings were in an absolute free fall in the autumn of 2022. So, the argument goes that the government was feeling immense pressure to look tough and take a hardline stance against the Family Federation to try and stop the political bleeding. Okay, so you've got this big political move. But as our source points out, it didn't just happen in a vacuum. It kicked up a whole storm of constitutional problems. The focus now shifts from why they did it to how they did it, and whether it was even done properly. Now, before we go any further, there's a key concept we've got to talk about: due process. It's right there in Japan's constitution, and it's this bedrock idea that the government can't just do whatever it wants. It has to play by the rules, follow fair procedures, especially when it's about to take away someone's rights. And this is where things get really murky, according to this source. For a policy shift this huge, there was no new formal cabinet decision. There are no official records of legal consultations. Nothing on the Prime Minister's schedule. And when reporters asked for an explanation of how this all went down, the government basically said no comment. And this really gets to the heart of the matter. A constitutional scholar cited in the source, Munakazu Tomoeko, put it perfectly. He said that a transparent process, one that's open to public criticism, is absolutely fundamental. The source argues that this is precisely what was missing here. All right, now we're getting into what is honestly the most shocking claim in the source material. The idea that the very evidence the government built its case on was itself, well, deeply compromised. And the allegation is pretty stark. The source, pulling from a report by the Family Federation's lawyers, claims that witness statements submitted to the court by the Ministry of Education weren't just a little inaccurate, but were intentionally and systematically fabricated. Let me give you a concrete example of how this allegedly played out. The source brings up a witness they call Believer C. This person stated they donated out of their own free will and faith, but the official document from the ministry, it claimed the donations were made out of fear of things like ancestral karma and falling into hell. One person says one thing, the government document says something completely different. And a source argues this wasn't just some one-off typo, it was part of a pattern. And the irony here is just, wow. The source points out that the Ministry of Education, the very same government body accused of doing this, has its own incredibly strict guidelines that define fabricating data as serious misconduct. So, setting aside all the questions about how this happened and the evidence they used, there's another massive legal hurdle our source dives into. Was the government's action even a proportional response? Was it the right tool for the job? At the heart of this is something called the principle of proportionality. You can think of it as a constitutional safety brake on government power. It basically says, hey, if you're going to limit a fundamental right, like freedom of religion, your action has to be the least restrictive way possible to achieve your goal. No using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. So how does it work? Well, it usually comes down to 3 key questions. Is the action suitable for the goal? Is it actually necessary? Or is there a gentler way? And finally, is it balanced? Does the good it does outweigh the harm? The source we're looking at argues that the government's dissolution request fails big time on that second test, necessity. And this is where the source really pushes back on the government's case. It points out that the government had already created other tools to deal with the problem. A brand new law was passed to help victims get money for legal costs and to keep a closer eye on the group's assets. Plus, a 2017 court ruling had already said that helping individual victims should be handled through civil lawsuits, not by dissolving the whole organization. With all these other options on the table, the source argues the all-or-nothing nuclear option just wasn't necessary. And that brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, and maybe the most important one. We're zooming out now, because the source argues this isn't just about one religious group. This is about setting a dangerous precedent that could impact religious freedom for everyone in Japan. And a survey mentioned in our source really paints a picture of just how divided the religious community is on this. Sure, 9 groups thought the government's move was appropriate, but 5 said it was inappropriate, and another 5 didn't answer at all, which kind of tells you just how sensitive and concerning this whole thing is. And you can hear that worry in the actual words of other major religious groups. Seicho no Ii said they had strong doubts, pointing right at the political motives. Soka Gakkai said they would be watching to make sure that politics doesn't just arbitrarily interfere with religion, which is a cornerstone of Japan's constitution. And this isn't just a domestic squabble either. The source makes the case that this action might even violate international agreements Japan has signed, agreements that protect religious freedom and say any restrictions have to be clear, narrow, and absolutely necessary. This is actually something the UN has warned Japan about in the past. So it all leaves us with this one final critical question that the source material puts on the table. In a democracy that's built on the rule of law, when intense political pressure crashes head-on into fundamental principles like due process and religious freedom, which one is supposed to be the one that bends?